I'm really curious about your approach towards testing for your serverless applications. I imagine you have, say, a lot of Lambda functions, but do you also do things like using direct integrations, from API Gateway or AppSync or EventBridge? How do you tackle those kind of problems, when it comes to testing?
Okay, so we use CDK, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter. But in the end, we use CDK, so we have some extra special CDK specific tests. I know you're not a big fan of those, but I promise you that I have a good reason, and they're very, very accurate. So we're gonna get there. So the idea for me as a developer is that I don't want to leave the IDE. I want to work in the IDE, do everything in the IDE. I want fast, repeatable tests, and I want to have as much as confidence that my code is going to run on the cloud the same way that it runs on my IDE. And the way I can achieve, to run my Lambda function in the IDE is very simple. I have several layers, like a testing pyramid. The names might be different between companies. It's a different definition, but I think the ideas are the same. So I have unit tests, which everybody has. For me, since I use Pydantic for schema validation and input validation, things like that, the unit tests are usually specifically, they cover a lot of schema validations because we usually write like very complex validations. We really add like custom validators and more complicated schemas. So it's important to have those tested to make sure that you're covered. And then you can also test very specific layers, like models, very specific models, very specific functions that you want to mock. Make sure that input A goes in, input out, input B goes out, output B goes out. So this is very specific. Then you have the integration layer, which is basically most of the tests are going to be there. The integration are run post-deployment. And why is that? Because I want to use AWS resources. I want to use real resources. Our developers usually, we all use the same account, but we have different stacks. So your stack might have a prefix per developer. So we can all work on the same service and have like our own virtual our own stack and virtual service, whatever. We use our own resources at the same account. So the way we do it is we generate the event data that I want to test, like the input that I want to test for my Lambda function. It can be behind an SQS, or it can be behind an API gateway or whatever. And I use PyTest, I call the function in DE, and I can debug it. And I can choose whenever I have a call to AWS API, I can choose whether to mock it or not. So the happy path would just use real services with real responses, and I can really debug it properly. And then you have the edge cases. I want to see that if I fail to put the item into DynamoDB, I want to see that I can catch the exception properly, and my handler returns the internal server error or whatever I want to return. So that's where I use mocks. I don't like to use Moto, if you're familiar with it. I use it only in very specific cases where it's really hard to generate the use case that I'm trying to go for. For example, I'm going to use an API for list organization. I want to list all the accounts there, and I want to have an organization with 2,000 accounts. That's really hard to do like a real API call, right? So that's where Moto is really good. And that's the only use case that I'd use it, because we did found some bugs where Moto didn't replicate the API call properly, like 100%. It wasn't the same response that you're going to get from the service. And if you use Moto, then you can't really use, if you use Moto with one service, you can't really use the other services with Moto. It kind of encapsulates everything, and everything's going to get mocked, which is not what I'm going for. So that's from the integration side of things. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it's actually exactly what I do. The approach you're talking about is exactly what I do. What I nowadays they call remote code testing, so that you
Mhm.
execute your code locally, but you're talking to the remote services like the DynamoDB and things like that. Except for the sort of the failure paths or things that are really difficult to hit the real
Yeah.
thing, and I'll use mocks for those. And like I said, I'll have unit tests for my domain logic. And then I guess we will have end-to-end tests as well. Once the whole thing is deployed, you test the whole thing end-to-end by calling API gateway or whatever is the entry point for your service. And I guess you've got the same thing as well, right?
Yeah, I see we're synced, but wait a second, we're gonna get out of sync in a second when I talk about CDK tests. Yeah, it makes total sense for the async part in end-to-end. I think the key is to trigger the entire event from start to end. And then it can get tricky because it really depends whether your async part has any side effects that you can really validate. And if not, we've had one approach, and we did only on the test accounts, not in production, where you can deploy, if you send an event bridge message or SNS message at the end of the flow, you can create a tester listener on the SNS, like an SQS that will listen and trigger a Lambda. And that Lambda will write to a download table or an SQS message. So you'd have some side effects. So you can see that it actually works. And then your PyTest will do some polling with a timeout and make sure that the end message gets to the SQS that you wanted and the message looks like what you expect it to look like. It's not fun to write such code, but I think that's the best way to really see it works end to end properly.
Yeah, that's what I do as well. And for async tests, that has the side effects for things like one of the functions pushing something to event bridge, for example, and triggering some other people's code run. I tend to use ephemeral environment so that that doesn't happen. So I've got my own event bridge bus just for my stack. So for the feature I'm working on, so nobody else is going to be listening to my DynamoDB streams or mine event bridge bus. That's how I kind of isolate the testing environments rather than try to use the mocks and things like that. Like the same as you, I like to hit the real thing, make sure that it actually works rather than just use the mocks. And I've seen so many false positives because you never actually test the call to DynamoDB or to EventBridge or to whatever service. You're hitting a mock and you're telling the mock to say, okay, everything's good, but it's not because you got a syntax error or something in your code.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, so now for the part you're not gonna maybe not agree. So, and there's another layer. I call it the security tests, and it runs before the integration, before the deployment part. And this is where I synthesize my CDK into a CloudFormation template, and I can run all sorts of tests around it. I use usually CDK nag to make sure that I got everything covered. It basically looks for misconfigured buckets, like open buckets, or maybe you have an overly privileged role, or you misconfigured. You're not using. I think you can define your custom rules across the organization and share that, and then you can enforce like a security approach in CDK nag. We obviously have other tools, but it's a very easy tool to implement. So why not? You can see an example for that in the my AWS Lambda Handler Cookbook template. So I see that you're nodding, so I think that you're okay with that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you don't do CDK, you don't use the things like CDK nag, you end up using something like a cloud custodian or other things, or AWS config. Yeah, something to validate, make sure that you are following best practices when it comes to how you configure your resources. Either you do that before deploy or you do that post deploy. So it's something that you should be doing regardless.
Yeah, I think you shouldn't do it post deploy because then, it's too late. You have the security breach potentially. So
yeah. But I mean, the post deploy is in your like a lower environment, not in production.
Okay, got it. Okay, got it. Sure. That makes sense. Okay, so another test that Now this is because it happened, right? It happened to us, so that's why we did it. We have tests for making sure that some resources exist, and sometimes that they have not changed their logical ID. And the reason I'm saying that is CDK, you can write code. Code can raise exceptions. Now, we had an issue where somebody wrote try except in the CDK code and they caught the exception. I have no idea why, but it's code and you can do it. So CDK raised an exception, some error that it had during the deployment, some validation, whatever. And the exception was ignored and it continued on and synthesized the CloudFormation template. And eventually what happened is that the critical resource was missing in our deployment, which is not good, because then you're gonna potentially find out that when you have your tests, right? Or when a customer tries to access the code that uses that resource. So that's not ideal. And also in other cases, if you move around resources from one construct to another, you're potentially changing their logical ID. And some developers are not really aware of that. That's very dangerous, especially when you're dealing with stateful resources like DynamoDB tables and things like that. So what will happen is that the table will get deleted, the original table will get deleted and reconstructed again. But this time it will be empty without all your precious data, which is not great. So these are kind of things that you should, I think, write a very specific pre-deployment CDK unit test. Make sure that these stateful items exist and that their logical IDs do not change. And that's one option. Another option, if you don't want to write these code, you don't want to write these tests, is to use third-party tools like CDK diff. CDK diff, you can add it to your CI/CD pipeline, and it visualizes the changes that your CDK code in that PR are going to make. So you're going to see, I'm going to delete the table and I'm going to build a new table. Now, it's not blocking the pull request, but it gives you visualization so the code reviewer can understand if there's a potential risk in the pull request or not. So I think these are the two approaches. So you can either do I want to protect my code 100% and do the tests, or I'm going to do the best effort and depend that my engineers are going to notice that and use CDK diff.
Yeah, I guess I don't agree with that being the only two choices. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned there was if a stateful resource was missing, the only time when the customer, you find out is when the customer actually uses that. That tells me that you've got a big gap in your end-to-end testing, that your end-to-end test or other tests before that should have picked it up, especially if you're using remote code testing, because your local code be hitting those resources presumably. The other thing I guess you mentioned was the logical ID changing. So I guess I'm not 100% sure how you protected against that in the example you gave, because you were moving stuff around from different stacks. So the thing
you can assert that the logical ID is a constant that you put in the code and you make sure that it doesn't change, because you can override the logical ID if you really want for the resources the first time they're created, right? And then you have a constant.
Okay, but I thought you said that you are moving them between different stacks, or is that not the?
Not stacks, constructs.
Construct. Okay, construct. Okay,
yeah.
Okay. Sorry, missed that. Yeah. So in that case, you can also can you not use things like the deletion policy to make sure that if that does kind of happen and people accidentally, change something, because it's not just the logical ID, but it's also other things that causes CloudFormation to do a replacement. So DynamoDB, for example, if you accidentally change any of the schema configuration, it would you do a replacement. So you can also use the deletion policy to make sure that if that does happen, you're not going to just lose all of your existing data because.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you have retained policies, you have backups in DynamoDB, and we actually use the backup for that case. But even if you have the retain, the the application is still using, and the environment, if you pass the environment variable to the Lambda, it's still going to use the new DynamoDB table. I mean, your data is not going to get lost, which is great, but your application is still not going to access the old data. So that's not great. And I totally agree with what you said about code coverage. I think in an ideal world, yeah, you're going to have perfect tests and perfect code coverage, and that's not going to happen. But reality is that teams are not doing 100% coverage. And even if you have 100% coverage, it doesn't mean that you cover the 100% business use cases for coverages. So, I mean, code coverage and business use cases are not always the same, and you have feature flags sometimes, and that really makes it even more difficult. So yeah, it's not ideal. I do have another idea. We do use another option that really helps to minimize the impact of such failures. Is we use code deploy, and when we use canary deployments for Lambda functions. So in those Lambdas, with code deploy, you can define tests and really simulate whatever you want to simulate. And then if the Lambda uses that resource, if it's missing, it's going to fail. You're going to get a rollback. So that's great. So that's one approach, but it has its limits, and it really depends on, again, you're not going to do like a complete full-blown test there, but I think more sanity tests, because it's really complicated to write those tests. But again, it's like another layer of protection that you can add.
Yeah, but then if you can't trust your developers to write good tests and have a decent coverage for your normal application code, then you're going to really struggle to get them to write those kind of tests that you run as part of a code deploy, because it's, like I say, it's even harder to run those as part of deployment. And with code deploy, I also find that when it comes to isolating the errors, as far as I know, when you have at least that's what I tried last time when I tried to use code deploy. The metrics are not executed when using the Lambda weighted alias, assuming the metrics are not going to the exact version. The metrics are going to the alias. So you can't tell if when using the alias to say split the traffic like 10 and 90% to two different versions. If you see an error, you can't tell if it's coming from the new version or the old version.
Oh. Okay.
That's what I observed when I tried to use code deploy with the Lambda weighted alias before. I don't know if they changed it because they only record one dimension, as far as I know, to the when you're hitting the when you're invoking a function to via an alias. So I found that okay, you can observe that there's like an increase or like a difference in terms of error percentage, but you can't quite isolate it to the version that you're looking for.